Storm's End held the wind like a clenched fist. Gales came in from Shipbreaker Bay eating salt and rain. But the old walls, thick as the roots of a mountain, drank the fury and tossed back only a low, steady thrum. In the Underkeep, in a vault converted into a forge, Gendry Baratheon, if that was his name now, stood bare-armed to the shoulder, skin slick, lungs full of coal heat. He had asked for the forge as a condition of taking any title. The castle had plenty of hearths and plenty of smiths. Still, no other hammer felt right. He drew the ingot from the coals, set it under the hammer, and worked it until the sound of iron filled the room, ringing up into the belly of the fortress. He could feel the shape inside the metal like it wanted to be a thing. He judged the tilt of his wrist, the angle, the force. He was not forging a weapon. He was making nails. Nails to repair storm-shattered galleries and shutters up on the sea-bitten towers. A lord, they said, didn't need to work with his hands. A lord had men to do that. But he had never been just one thing, and he didn't know how to pretend otherwise. The door opened and Sir Davos Seaworth came in with his cloak hanging wet and his mouth already halfway to a smile. "If this is what a lord's day looks like, I've been keeping the wrong company," Davos said. Gendry cooled the iron in the trough, steam rising like ghosts. "It keeps me from thinking too much. Thinking's half the work of a lord. Half the trouble too." Davos drew nearer, rubbing his hands before the forge as if it were a hearth. "Your banners arrived from Tarth, from Swan and Fell. A messenger from Nightsong. The lords of the Stormlands will hear you. It's not the old court, but it's the one we've got." Gendry set the hammer down, the head still warm, and leaned on the table. "They'll come to look at Robert's bones and say they see him in my face. They'll want a stag they remember. I'm not him. Thank all the gods for that," Davos said gently. "The realm may love Robert's songs and his hunts and his laugh, but you know who counted the coin after and figured how to feed what his joy left hungry." Gendry wiped his hands on a rag that had once been a nobleman's curtain. "I know how to swing a hammer and straighten a bent axle. I know how to keep a kit of tools dry. I don't know how to feed a city. I don't know how to stop a queen without putting people in the ground." Davos's smile dimmed. He looked older in the forge light, the lines at his eyes carved deep by salt and smoke and loss. "We do what we must, lad. The man riding at our gates is proof enough that the world isn't done with necessity. He won't ask for pageantry. He never did." Gendry felt the wind outside press a palm against the high narrow window like an impatient visitor. "Jon Snow," he said, as if the name were the thing itself. "The man whose blood ran like a still river, who carried his duty like a shield without markings." Gendry had fought beside him north of the wall. He had seen him breathless and stubborn on the ice, a man who would run until his lungs burned and go on running. You can follow a man like that. The thought had come to him not as a decision but a fact, like the way iron cooled if left too long in the air. He left the forge with Davos and climbed up through corridors polished by centuries of storms and oil. The great hall of Storm's End opened like a cavern. Antlers hung over the high seat, and the banners of noble houses, Swan's black and white, Tartha's quartered blue and pink, Dondarrion's lightning bolt, stirred in the drafts. In the keep's throat the sound of the sea was a constant, a friend who never slept. Jon Snow stood before the sea doors with his cloak thrown over his shoulders and dark hair matted with spray. He had brought few men, and those showed their wear without shame. A northern captain with frost scars across one cheek, a young man with a boy's frank stare who clung to the edge of the room like an apprentice, Lord Davos's men and boatmen, two quiet riders with faces like carved wood. Jon turned at Gendry's step and something eased in his face. Relief or perhaps a shared memory of the road. They clasped wrists, workman to workman. "Lord of Storm's End," Jon said, and Gendry felt the words like a weight he could learn to carry. Jon's eyes, gray as wet stone, moved to Davos and back. "Thank you for seeing me so quickly." Gendry glanced at the sea doors, whose bronze muscles bore old green tarnish. "The storms here don't ask. It's not me granting permission." He gestured to the high seat but did not take it. He had sat there only once and felt the chair's history crawling up his spine like ivy. They walked instead to the shielded balcony where the wind smelled of salt and weed and lightning. Below the castle, the sea hurled itself at the cliffs, white as torn wool where it broke. The horizon crouched, heavy with weather. "We don't take King's Landing with fire," Jon said without ceremony. "We don't take it with siege towers and battering rams. We don't need to take it at all. We need it to open itself." Gendry watched a gull tumble on the air, wings stiff, trusting the wind to set it right. "And how does a city open itself?" he asked. "By being shown a door that's not a pyre," Jon said. "Cersei locks people in with fear. We show them the latch. Bread is a better key than steel." "Bread," Davos repeated as if tasting the word. "That and time. Neither comes cheap." Jon nodded. "You can stop the sea, Lord Gendry." There was no mockery in the use of the title. "Shipbreaker Bay is yours, and the lords that remember your father's banners will answer your raven. The gullet can be watched by friends on Driftmark and Claw Isle, if they'll have us on terms of peace. Rosby and Stokeworth feed half the city when the fields run, but they're not Lannister to the bone. Most of the Crownlands aren't. We help them decide who their neighbors are." "So a blockade," Gendry said, the word heavy, peaceful as a closed door. "Does a door care that men pound their fists and bleed their knuckles?" "The door would," Jon said quietly, and Gendry understood he meant himself. "We'll send letters promising safe passage for any who leave the city. Food enough in camps a day's march along the King's Road. No one raised to fight on their way north, no levy demanded. The Unsullied can keep order outside the walls without stepping foot inside them. The dragons will stay to the heights." The last words came as if he had practiced them against another's will. Gendry looked over the battlements to the thick white line where waves took the stone. "Euron Greyjoy sails in, and we have nets and prayers. The Iron Fleet is not a rumor, Jon." "No," Jon said, and there was a weariness to the word that made Gendry think again. Of a man who had stood on a broken wall and seen the snow be red soap, and seen it stop. "But we have Davos Seaworth, who knows what ships can do and more importantly what they can't. And we have the truth of what this is. We are not here to burn a city for the ghost of a throne." At that name, throne, the wind seemed to lean closer. It always came down to iron shaped into a chair and all the cruel tangles around it. Gendry thought of Arya's eyes laughing and merciless, and the way she had turned from him when he had asked for something she could not be. She had been braver than he was that day. He wondered where she was now, north, south, nowhere at all, a shadow between stones. Davos laid his fingers on the damp stone of the parapet like a sailor feeling a hull's seams. "The blockade holds in water and land. We'll float booms, a line of chained hulks just off the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. Not so close to invite fire, close enough to matter. A man can't row through chains. Nets over the shallow runs. I can smell the winds from Duskendale. A south wind, and they think they can dash through. We make them choose between running and drowning." His mouth twisted. "I've helped ships into forbidden harbors all my life. It'll be a strange thing to hold them out. But this is the right strangeness." Gendry's jaw worked at nothing. He said, "And inside the city?" Jon's gaze went far and hard. "Inside, fear, and Qyburn's little toys, and a queen who wasn't born to step aside. There will be hunger. There will be anger. There will be men who will call us cowards for not storming their walls, and men who'll call us murderers for standing outside. We carry that, and we don't set it down because the load's unpleasant." Gendry nodded. "All right," he said. "Then tell me what you need from a man who learned to make horseshoes and was told yesterday he must weigh the lives of thousands on his thumb. They worked until the light shifted to iron, until servants brought soup and hard cheese and wine, until the sea turned black and flung spray like shards against the windows. Ravens took their messages to Duskendale, to Rosby's pale fields, to Stokeworth's apple orchards, to the sea lords of Driftmark and Claw Isle whose ships were small but clever, and to Tarth where the Evenstar weighed honor like a balance in his hands. The King's Road north of the city would carry not soldiers but wagons of flour, barrels of salt fish from White Harbor, oats and onions and rye. Camps were marked out on maps, places where earth lay high and ground stayed dry, places with streams that rarely failed even in hard seasons. There would be no banners of victory flying from them, no drums. The lords of the Stormlands gathered 3 days later. Selwyn Tarth, thick-shouldered and thinning of hair, came with the sun on his cloak. House Swan's riders wore black and white and the memory of old battles. The Dondarrions sent a widow with oaths wrapped like linen around her wrists. For the Lord of Blackhaven had died at a ford, and no other had yet thrown lightning from their hands. The men and women who came to swear or refuse looked at Gendry with candle-keen eyes. He stood on the step below the high seat and did not grin or roar or promise glory. He said he wanted to keep them alive. He said he wanted to keep their children alive too. He did not apologize for being who he was. When they spoke of Robert, oh, his arms, his wine, his song, Gendry only inclined his head and let it pass. Winter men in gray and white stood in that southern hall with their cloaks shedding the faint scent of cold. A pact, Jon said when the last of the vows lay like new cooled iron across the table. Stark and Baratheon, the direwolf and the crowned stag. We bind ourselves not for a season or for a victory, but because we know what winter does to people who stand alone. We keep the conditions. No sack, no burnings, no siege engines, no pulling the city down around the poor. We will stop ships with rope and timber and the truth. The lords of the Crownlands who throw off Lannister gold will be given back their pride. The ones who refuse will not be hunted into corners. When this is done, there will be food for the city, not feasts for us. Selwyn Tarth bowed his head, eyes pale as a northern sea. You speak like a man who's had enough of the easy lies of victory. Victories come dear enough, Jon said. We don't need to gild them. When the tidings reached the Red Keep, Queen Cersei was sitting in a room painted with hunting scenes. Hounds leapt after stags that always ran a finger's breadth faster than the dogs' open mouths. The paint had cracked along the ribs of the animals, a hair-thin line of age no one else would have noticed. She noticed. She held her goblet by the stem and watched the messenger's mouth shape the words. Pact, the blacksmith bastard wearing her dead husband's antlers. A blockade. Promises of cruelty clothed in linens of mercy. Cersei smiled in a way that did not disturb the stillness of her face, because stillness could make men stupid with fear. Bread camps, she said, as if tasting a dish cooked by a rival. Avon's full of promises. The North always did love to pretend their iron roughness was virtue. Qyburn stepped from the shadows, every step soundless, as if he had taught his boots to be kind to stone. There is not enough grain in the city to feed every mouth for long, he said. But there is enough to feed the mouths that matter. Your Grace, I can make this a handful of days. They will start to cry their throats raw. You need only outlast their pity. Pity? Cersei said softly, letting the word curl in her mouth. She thought of burning green light bulging from the belly of a temple, of silence after a long, loud thing, the sweetness of it. I have outlasted worse. Euron Greyjoy stood at her window, the smell of sea rot and pitch clinging to him like a lover. He wore rings of pale metal that didn't look like silver and smiled with all his teeth, wolfish and amused. Rope and hulks? Clever. My ships have sailed through cleverer gates. We'll see if the Onion Knight knows the sea as well as he thinks. He looked too pleased in his own skin. Cersei wanted to scrape him raw with a word and stopped herself. With Euron you saved your sharpest cut for just before the blood. Go then, she said. Go and teach them that the sea answers to no one. She poured a little wine out on the tiles as if for a friend gone to war. She thought of bread camps and smirking northerners and that bastard with a hammer. Her hand moved idly to the curve of her belly as if remembering something, and then she took another sip and waited. Outside the city walls, between the King's Road and a little stream where women from a nearby hamlet came to pound their washing, men raised canvas and posts and dug latrines and coaxed fires to life. A banner hung there, not of victory but of assurance. A crowned stag beside a dire wolf, each facing the other as if in conversation. People came a few at a time at first, men with the look of routine defiance finally gone sallow at the edges, women with children whose bellies were not yet hollowed by hunger. They came in under watchful northern eyes and were given bread and water and a place to sleep. They were watched by Unsullied, who stood as straight as stakes and spoke softly if at all. Arya Stark sat near the entrance to a tent and trimmed her nails with a little knife. She wore plain linen and a cap that hid the quickness in her face. She had come when she heard the plan as a message in the winter camp. She had not told anyone she would. She did not always know where her own feet would take her until they did. Gendry found her there because of course he did. He stood very still, as if movement would spook something in the air between them. "My lady," he said, and then swallowed the words and tried again. "Arya, Lord Storm's End," she replied in a voice that made the title not ridiculous but only slightly too big for him. He sat on an upturned crate. He had shaved but missed a spot under his ear. His hands were nicked small cuts that had not yet closed. "I asked you for something I had no right to," he said without prompting. "A forge is easier than a heart." Arya flicked a shaving of nail into the dust. "What did you do with the ring?" she asked, and he blinked as if catching up to where her mind had gone. "I melted it down," he said. "Put it into a hinge for a door to the old library at Storm's End." She nodded. "That's a good use." She slid her knife into her boot. "There are things in the red keep your pitiful mercy won't cut. Wildfire in the cellars. Crossbows on towers aimed where a parley might be. If you mean nonviolence, you'd better make sure your piece doesn't walk under a trap." "We can't burn the city to stop her from burning the city," he said stubbornly, and she had to bite down on the urge to grin because yes, that sounded like him. "I didn't say burn," she said. "I said take her toys away." Arya left that night without much fanfare. She went alone because she had learned a long time ago that she was her own best company. The city was a familiar strangeness. The September's huge absence yawning like a missing tooth. The streets crowded and narrow and full of fish and piss. She had a way of being where she shouldn't and not being where she should. And soon she knew which cellars smelled like dry straw and which like ancient oil, which rat holes had been packed with green clay by hands that never shook. She marked the places quiet as breath, and sometimes she lifted a lid and let the air in to spoil a thing that wanted to burn too well. Sometimes she left a little token, a smudge, a scratch, a sliver of a true face, that others in quiet fellowship would understand and finish. Euron came with smoke in his wake. The Iron Fleet slid along the horizon, black as beetles, sails like wings cut out of the night. Davos stood on the headland with his fingers pressed to his lips as if he were swallowing a story. "He'll try to rope us close," Davos said. "We keep our distance. We let rope and tide do half the work. We don't fight unless we must. Remember that." Boats, small, quick, cut off from the long line of hulks and nosed toward the mouth of the Blackwater. The booms hung there, a necklace of dead ships bound together, their masts laced with rope, their bellies weighted with stone. Men in Stormland and Crownland boats tended them, polemen and netmen and old sailors who felt knots with reverence. The Iron Fleet came happily, arrogantly, the way a bully goes to a fair. They found the booms less than merry. The first of Euron's galleys tried the rope and rolled her belly to it, bit down and dragged, and then the weight came on like an anchor from heaven. A second went to help and got her oars in a tangle of hemp. A third held off and laughed and then felt her owner sweep catch at something under the water, and half her deck went to shouting and swearing. Euron's flagship cut a pretty arc and fixed to dance around the edge of the mess, and that was when a current turned a dead ship against her and pushed, not hard, just enough to make calculation a minute late. She did not break. She did not even sound her death. She simply stopped moving forward with surety, and in water, hesitation is its own breaking. Davos's cruised through lines and cut lines and used poles like spearless spears to turn hulls back from the worst of it. Euron promised himself murder very loudly to the wind and went to look for a hole elsewhere. It was like watching a fox find out that a fence was real and not a story. He grinned as if he had enjoyed even that much. He would be back, Davos thought. But each run wore patience thin, and in a siege, time was not on the side of pride. In the camps, a boy from Flea Bottom stood transfixed by a pot of onion soup, the steam lifting into his face like a blessing. A northern woman with hair the color of old hay ladled him a bowl and another when he finished the first too fast. No one asked him who he was. He had a name, Tabat, because he had been born in a back room of a tabac shop, but names were money, and money was sometimes a lie you told to yourself to feel safe. He slept that night on rough blankets and dreamed of a street he used to think was his world. In the morning he watched a quiet soldier set up a line and show a handful of children how to throw a hook into the river without tangling their own feet. There would be fish sometimes. Not always. Sometimes only the glint of water. But the line was a kind of hope you could hold, not some sermon from a man on a horse who would ride away at dusk into something better. Inside the Red Keep, Queen Cersei stood on a balcony and watched the smoke that hung where the sea did its work. She had not slept. Jaime came to her then, the fine lines at his mouth deeper than habit. He looked thinner to her. She was irritated by the suggestion of austerity in his face. "You'll ride out," she said without preamble. "You'll parley. You'll buy me a week." She did not say please. They had lost that word between them somewhere, and she had not gone back for it. Jaime wiped his mouth with his hand, a gesture out of place on a man in gold. "I'll ride out," he said. "I'll ask your enemies to leave. You'll remind them that the city has endured worse," she said. "You'll remind them what happens to those who try to starve lions." He looked at her as if she were on the other side of glass. "I'll tell them there need not be lions," he said, and the old trouble in her face returned. The way he had been pulling away since their child died, since the girl before her died, since everything that had ever tried to be simple had broken itself on his attempt to make it so. She laughed. "No lions," she said. "Of course, yes. Ask the wolves to be so kind as to be dogs." He rode out to the camps at dusk. Gendry and Jon went to meet him with Davos, and two Unsullied stood behind like carved figures on a ship's prow. The ground was damp, the sky a thin pewter lid. Jaime's horse stamped. He looked at Jon, then at Gendry, and his eyes flickered, recognition tying a knot from long memory. "You've the look of your father," he said before he could stop himself, and at once something weary inside him wished it back. "I fought beside him once," Jaime added, the words tasting of old iron. "I worked his forge," Gendry said. He didn't know it. The words had no jaggedness. They sat in the air as if they had always been there. "The Queen is willing to offer terms," Jaime said carefully. "She needs assurances that the safety of those within the walls will be guaranteed, that the city will not be sacked, that—" "No sacks," Jon said. "No fires. We opened food camps a day's walk. We'll open more. Anyone who comes out will be fed and not compelled. If you want to escort them, you'll be allowed. But the gates open or they starve. That's the thing you have to count, Ser Jaime. Not banners, not oaths, bread and days. We won't march in. We won't set ladders. We'll wait. And in waiting, yes, some will die. But fewer will die than if the sky falls in flames." Jaime's gaze turned toward the city as if he could see through walls. Qyburn's hand, Cersei's cup. Something in him flickered like a candle in a draft. "If she agrees," he said, and let the impossibility hang. "If she agrees to leave, then she leaves," Gendry said. "With an escort if she chooses. To Casterly Rock or to the sea. She leaves. The city stays. She never returns. That is the mercy we have." He felt every word sit on his tongue like a brick. Jaime bowed his head by the smallest degree. "I'll take your words to her." At the parley on the King's Road 2 days later, they met nearer the walls, with the mud gate glowering and the tiled roofs beyond like scales on a beast's back. It was a tense congregation. Cersei on a raised dais with a balustrade of archers behind her, Qyburn at her shoulder pale and thriving, the mountain a bulwark of brute promise. On the ground before them Jon and Gendry stood with 100 men at a generous distance. Tyrion came then, slipping from the crowd with his cloak held up against the wind, his eyes hopping from face to face like a bird that knows the cat is always somewhere. "My queen," Tyrion called up, as if the distance were a parlor. "We're offering you a walk. It's an old-fashioned remedy, good for the knees and the soul." Cersei smiled and let her cup tilt just shy of spill. "You always thought yourself a jester," she said, and her voice carried well. which would be charming if you had a jester's courage to jest at your own head on the block. You want me to leave my city, walk away from the house I built because a northern bastard and a blacksmith say they've raised yeoman tents in a nettle field? You forget who I am. I forget many things, sister, Tyrion said. I have been hit on the head a number of times, but I do remember a few numbers. I remember how much grain a city of 500,000 consumes in a day. I remember how fast that runs dry. And I remember the color of wildfire and what it looks like on small faces. Cersei's eyes slid over Jon and settled on Gendry. She studied his posture, as if trying to find a trick in it. He was straight-backed and without adornment beyond the stag at his breast. "Do you like the taste of power, Smith?" she said softly. "Does it taste like steel left on the tongue?" "It tastes like ash," he said, honest and unadorned. And she laughed because she thought he meant fear, and he meant the residue of too many fires started by men who thought they were God. Somewhere a gull called. Somewhere a bowstring creaked. The arrow snapped through the air from a balcony before any of the men below reached for a shield. It was well aimed, clean, a killing shot at a throat. Brienne of Tarth, who had stood off to the side with her hair under a plain helm and a cloak concealing her bulk, moved without thinking. Her shield tilted, caught the arrow, threw it up and aside, and the shaft spun like a foolish idea into the dust. The men below drew breath as one. A second arrow did not follow. It had not been Cersei's order. Arya, in a vantage no one saw, had her own bowman quiet in a dark, empty way, and would do the same for the next and the next. Qyburn's mouth tightened, as if someone had spoiled a trick he had carefully wound up. "No more parley," Jon said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the decision like a bell. "We will not come again. The camps stand. The sea stands. Those who leave may leave. No one else dies for a throne." Cersei's face did not change. Qyburn's gaze slid along the parapets, measuring again what he had been sure of. Jaime stood behind his sister and watched a piece of world settle into a different shape without anyone's hands on it. He had seen castles taken and cities sacked and men named kings with bells tolling. He had never seen a decision hang like a door at dusk. The days that followed were a school of patience and conscience. The bread camps grew. The line of people coming out of the city lengthened. The city watch opened the gate now and then for an hour with grim inevitability, because the people inside could not be held with pikes and curses alone. They came carrying bundles, a stool, a bundle of sticks, a child in a sling, a dog with ribs showing. They came with lies about where they were going and truths sharper than knives. They came in the hope that the high people did not lie as well as they feared. One afternoon, a man in the yellow cloak of the watch came with his helm under his arm and asked if there was bread in those tents that let a man remember what bread tasted like. He had a saint's face, or perhaps the face of a gravedigger. Gendry gave him a loaf. The man chewed like a penitent. "Ser Kenric," he said after, "of the city watch, there's not a loaf left in half the storehouses. Your queen," he swallowed. "The queen. She hoards and calls it strategy. She forgets whose sons take her orders." "Ser Kenric," Jon said evenly, "we won't buy you. We won't trick you. We'll set the food where your men can see it. Decide who you answer to." Ser Kenric stared at the crust in his hand. "I remember the smell of the September when it fell," he said, and he said nothing else for a long time. Then, "We'll see who opens the gate tomorrow." That night Arya went deeper than she had before, behind doors only rats loved. She found a twig of a boy who must have been sent to light a fuse when told like a dog to sit and stay. She sat with him in the dark and showed him how to let a thing go from your hand and make it not matter. He cried once without sound. She touched his head. She thought of Gendry's mistake and mercy like a hinge opening in a door that had always been approached from the wrong side. Euron tried the runs twice more, and each time he found a new way to curse and called that victory. He had the Iron Men row fast and sly, slipping into gaps that did not exist, and the tide made a fool of him with the cheerfulness of a miller's donkey. On the third day a storm came out of nowhere, as they did here, and he went out into it laughing because men like him could not believe something larger and indifferent would not pick favorites. The storm did not, It sent 2 of his ships to the bottom without ceremony. He made a show of carelessness as he turned his fleet's long neck away from the booms, and the men in the little boats tending those ropes stood long after he passed, watching his back in their own hands, because humility is attention and they did not dare forget it. When hunger reached a certain pitch, it changed the sounds a city made. The market cries turned into barters that sounded like prayers. The wind carried a melody of emptiness. The Red Keep's kitchens continued to bake for those who mattered, but even noble faces thinned and sharpened like knives. Cersei never ate less than she wanted. When tyrants starve, the story ends. She read Qyburn's eyes and saw his sums change. She allowed herself a brief moment of rage that felt enjoyable, like scratching at a scab. Then she called for Jaime. "We go to the Rock," she said. "Not because they frighten me, because a war fought for time is a war a queen chooses the ground for. The field is wrong. The city is thankless. We leave now, and in a year or 2 we make them pay for this humiliation. We wear our patience like a cloak. And there," she smiled thinly, "is a child to think of." Jaime's face altered by a hair's width when she said child. He had been counting days too. "We walk out and what? Thank them for feeding those we won't. We walk out with our heads high and 1,000 swords around us," she said. "We tell the city they failed us. We tell the world we were not forced." She lifted her goblet and drank because letting wine touch her lip was an assertion of continued dominion. Could have gone that way. Nearly did. At dawn, the gates opened wider than they had in some time. The city watch stood in rows as if for a parade. Ser Kenric's helm shone faintly in the gray light, the polish thin and old. Jaime rode out at the head of a small column, white cloak tidy, the weight of oath like a familiar ache. Behind him wagons creaked, laden not with gold but with bulky bundles of cloth and private treasures. The Red Keep's practical spoils. Tyrion stood with Gendry and Jon and Davos outside the camps, as if expecting something he could not name. Cersei did not appear. Jaime waited long enough to make a point no one cared about. He turned his horse and rode back under the arch. He found her in Maegor's holdfast with the last of Qyburn's devices half laid around her like ribbons. She held a crossbow in her hands. The string was taut, and her eyes were as bright as any he had ever seen on her. Brighter even than the night they had been young and thought the world belonging. "You're not leaving," he said. He tried to put the smile in it that used to work. It fell like an old coin that no longer bought anything. "I am," she said. "But I will not walk through their pity. I will not have them thinking they shepherded me. I will make them flinch before I go." She lifted the bow a degree and Jaime saw that she had meant to carry it to the gate. To shoot a stag or a wolf and make the crowd scream and scatter so she could call her withdrawal a triumph. Qyburn watched from the door, his hands folded into sleeves like a pious man. The mountain stood implacable and patient. "Cersei," Jaime said, "if you do this, they will come in after. They will run. They will not stand forever outside your pride. And then King's Landing becomes the memory people use when they teach children what war is." Her lips trembled, and for a moment he saw the girl who had told him they were 2 halves of a whole. "If I go without a poison kiss," she said, "then I am not Cersei. If I go with thanks for their kindness, then I have not been queen. If I go with only myself, then why have I done any of this?" "Because there's a child," he said, and there was nothing else to say. The string of the crossbow eased with a soft, petulant sound as she let it slip. She handed the weapon to the mountain as if it were merely a misbehaving child. She looked at Qyburn. "We leave," she said. "Now, not under their eyes. By the river gate at noon. A barge with your quiet tricks. Not a parade." He inclined his head, which to Cersei felt like the first thing going right in some time. When the barge came to the river gate, Arya was waiting where no one thought to look. She had spent the night in the bones of the Red Keep, moving between rooms no one named now. She had left 3 tiny marks in places men with orders would pass and glance and be troubled with an unease they did not understand. She had put a ribbon of wax in a crank that mattered. She had breathed very shallowly for a long time in a closet where a rope hung and listened to the city's heart. When the barge slid out, low in the water, Cersei cloaked and surrounded by guards with their gold hidden. Arya slid from shadow to shadow on a rooftop and watched it move. On shore, Ser Kenric made a decision that would become a story told in cellar rooms for years. He turned, faced his men, lifted his hand and said, "Open the king's gate." The men looked at him as if he had asked them to swallow a coin. Then, one by one, they went to do it. The gate moved like something waking from a long dream. The city breathed. The people did not flood out howling. They walked as if embarrassed to be seen kneading. The camps took them in, and the Unsullied began the careful dance of keeping order with calm. Jon went forward, for there was nothing else to be done. He went under the arch into the city, the first of them, with Grey Worm at his shoulder and Davos an arm's length away and Gendry a step behind, feeling the weight of the moment as if it were his own hammer. Inside, the smell was old stone and too many bodies and something sweet that was nearly rot. In the streets, people watched. Jon raised his open hand once like a signal to someone only he could see. No bells rang. There were no bells. They took the Red Keep without a ladder, without a ram. When a group of Lannister soldiers in gilded helms stood across a corridor like a painting, Jaime stepped in front of them and said, "Stand down." And they did, as if he had said it for breakfast. In Maegor's holdfast, Cersei waited not with a crown but with a look she had put on instead. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not strike. She let herself be taken as if it were a game she would win in a later round. They offered her the river barge again, and this time she took it, because narrative loses to hunger as surely as pride loses to arithmetic. Gendry stood in a courtyard while the first carts of flour rattled over cobbles toward the city's bakeries. He had promises to keep, to feed first the children, then the mothers and the old, then the men who had done nothing but keep themselves alive. Sacks were opened, scales set on tables, large women with arms like stout branches set to kneading dough. The first smell of bread rose like a prayer. People wept at it. It was not a victory feast with wild boar and wine. It was a loaf in a hand and the taste of not starving. Tyrion came to stand beside Gendry, the bottom half of his face gray where he hadn't bothered to shave well. "It's strange," Tyrion said. "I thought if we ever took the city without blood I'd feel like a magician. I feel instead like a clerk who has at last figured out how to add." "You saved lives," Gendry said. "I failed at that before," Tyrion said. "I owed myself a correction. Maybe we all did." Jon was in the dragon pit, which had stood like a huge old scar on the city's shoulder for generations. They held the council there because there were no better halls not steeped in allegiance, because the sky was open and the air could move teach. Rough them. Sansa came from the north in time, quiet and splendid and pale, as if she were made of winter light. The lords of the Stormlands sat with Gendry among them without fuss, their oaths to him not shouted but enacted. Lord Yohn Royce sat with the weight of stone about him and the veil in his folded hands. Edmure Tully came, thin and scarred by humiliations, kept upright by humility more than pride. A few from the Reach, patched together by necessity and barley. Daenerys Targaryen stood before them all with her silver hair like a banner in the wind and dragons like rumors behind the clouds. She looked at Jon with a face in which pride and love and pain argued. He would not pick the fight she feared. He stepped aside as if he had always wanted to be off to the margins where the necessary work lives, where men pick up sacks and dig latrines and hold children up so they can see. "The North is its own," Sansa said, and the words hung there like a delicate point of law that was also a rock you could put your hand on. Jon nodded. Daenerys nodded too, slow as a woman who had traveled a long way and learned a few things she had not expected to know. "I do not need chains to rule," she said. "I need people to live." Gendry was confirmed as Lord of Storms end by the voices of those he had fed and those he would feed, by men who had been boys when Robert was alive and remembered his laugh as a weather that rolled through rooms. He did not rise and shout. He did not strike a pose. He stood there, hands human, and then went to order more flour into the city. Cersei sailed from the river gate at dusk with a dozen sworn men and Qyburn and a little chest of jewels that would go a long way in places that cared more for spark than for blood. She did not look back at the city because looking back gives the thing power. Jaime watched from the bank with a face that had finally decided to be what it was, and Brienne stood a pace behind him because there are duties you choose and duties that choose you. When the barge slid into the current, Arya watched from a hook of stone where shadows always lay. She felt the odd hollowness that came when you finished a task and discovered you had not grown another head, were still yourself. She sheathed her knife. Gendry found her at the Dragon Gate later, where a piece of rampart had fallen away and left a place to sit with a view of the river's slow shoulder. They did not speak at first, because sometimes the courtesy is to silence. "How many nails does it take to hold a city together?" Arya asked finally, her voice light. "More than I know how to make," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder for a breath. Then she straightened. "I'm not going to be a lady of a castle," she said. "I think I've known it since before I knew what a lady was. But I'll leave a place where you can find me. Not a castle. A way of walking." He looked at her with eyes that had learned to hold sadness without spilling it. "I'll build what I can and not build what I shouldn't," he said. "That's all I know how to promise." They sat a little longer in a wind that smelled of smoke and yeast and sea and a little of something like rain. In the days that followed, men took down the scorpions from the walls, and the wood went to bake bread. Nets around the booms were lifted, mended, and used to teach boys and girls with fingers eager to feel knots. The little waxen fuses that Arya and her shadows had spoiled were pulled up with tongs and tossed into baths of cold water until they went dead as bees at first frost. The City Watch learned how to direct a crowd to a bakery and away from a rumor. The Unsullied stood at intersections and guarded not a queen but a road. Davos went along the river in a skiff, pointing out where someday a ferry might earn an honest coin, and the men he told nodded as if he were lacing a shoe they had always known was loose. Tyrion wrote letters to bravos that did not mention kings and did mention bread. Jon stood once on the roof of the Great September's absence and let the wind comb his hair, and he thought of the wall and the ice and the people whose names he did not know who had made it possible for him to stand here alive. There would be more winters. There would be more fools. There would be work. He breathed and did not make it a symbol of anything. Gendry returned to Storm's End after the worst of the hunger had eased. The castle had learned his stride, and the wind through it no longer felt like a thing he needed to fight. In the forge he took out a bar of iron and he did not make a hammer. He made a bell. A small bell with a strong mouth and a tongue that would not crack. He hung it outside the old library door he had repaired with the melted ring and pulled the rope. The sound traveled through the keep and down into the old course of the sea like a hand held out to someone you mean to raise. He listened to it die away and smiled, not because it was triumph, but because it was not. On the first night when the city did not go to sleep hungry, a rain fell, the kind that cleans rather than harms. It tapped on the tiles and ran through the gutters with an undersong like laughter. Children woke and thought it was someone at the door. Men and women lay still and felt the strangeness of not being afraid. In the dragon pit, a meeting adjourned without fury. In the Red Keep, the kitchens, which had beggared themselves and their truth, set a pot to boil with bones and leeks for a broth that would taste like forgiveness if forgiveness had a flavor at all. Cersei, on her barge, watched the city become small and then become line and then become nothing. She touched her belly and thought of all the doors she had closed and all the ones that had closed on her, and she told herself a story about later and about return. Queens tell themselves stories all their lives. Some of them become true enough to live in for a time. Arya walked the city as if the streets were part of her training and part of her rest. She watched as a baker slid a peel into a newly vacuumed oven and drew out a flat loaf that was all heat and steam. She wondered whether traveling beyond the maps would feel like this. A known hunger fed by a work she had not thought to do. She smiled once, quick, feral, kind. Jaime Lannister, who had made and broken oaths until his oaths had become the thing that held him together as a lattice holds climbing roses, stood on a wall and breathed. Brienne stood near, and when a cry went up somewhere, a child hurt in a fall turned ankle, a small thing compared to all the great ones, they went to it without speaking and did what any two decent knights would do. This, too, is how kingdoms are kept. And in Storm's End, when the wind came hard at evening, the bell rang and the sound of it reached the surf and went out to sea, and the waves, which owe no one anything, lifted and fell. On nights like this, Gendry would set his palm to the old stone and feel, through the vibration, the life in it. A castle is a thing men build to make a statement to the weather and to time. This one had stood through 1,000 storms, and now it stood through a siege in which most of the swords in the city had not left their sheaths. He felt gratitude like a hand across his shoulders. A raven came then, as they always do in stories. It brought no calamity. It carried only a list of names. Bakers and carpenters and city watchmen and mothers and boys, and the odd noble who had put his hand to a pushcart and found that the world had not ended. People on a page who would eat and sleep and wake and go on, and maybe later make mistakes that kind men would try to set right. He set the list down by the window and walked back to the forge. There were always nails to make. There were hinges to fit. There were promises to keep. He drew new iron from the coals and set it under the hammer and began to shape it by listening to what it wanted to be, the way a city must be shaped by what it asks for. The ring of the hammer rose, and the castle answered in the low, approving tone of a place that had learned something. Outside, the sea, unconvinced by man's little meanings, went on with its work. Inside, men and women went on with theirs. In such days, a pact is not a necklace of oaths hung around a lord's throat. It is the daily, unglamorous refusal to be worse than the weather. It is how a door stays closed against fire and open to need. It is a bell rung at dusk to remind anyone within hearing distance that storms can be met without a blaze, that the old fury can be tempered into strength, that a city can be saved by the simple stubbornness of doing what you said you would. The bell's voice, bright and clean, traveled down into Shipbreaker Bay and back, and in the echo Gendry heard a promise that sounded at last like his own.